Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I am not going to lie, I am really excited and quasi starstruck because, and I kid you not, because this gentleman sitting beside me, Eric Weiner, wow, has written 2 books that I kid you not. If you want to know where a lot of my motivation has come from for where to take Artrageous and just some of my passion for like what's happening in culture and creativity, they come from the books that this guy has written. So luckily, Eric, thank you so much for finding some time coming in town to chat.
I am really happy to be here.
No, thanks. So we will, since I'm going to assume, and hopefully some people have already read these books, but if not, I'm going to convince a million people to go grab them. But nonetheless, can you first, though, assuming that maybe they don't know you, can you give us a little bit of background of just like who you are, where you're from, and how did you get to writing these books?
Well, essentially, I am a recovering journalist. For most of my career, I worked as a journalist at the New York Times and then at National Public Radio, and I was a foreign correspondent. So I lived and worked around the world, but I did the work of a journalist, which is really, when it comes down to it, focusing on the more negative aspects of life. Wars, diseases, upheaval, that's what a journalist, what a foreign correspondent does. And then I had one of those light bulb moments where I just thought, like, why am I doing this? I already, can be a kind of unhappy person sometimes. And here I was sort of, knee deep in other people's misery. It's important work, but it was kind of dragging me down. So I thought, what if instead I would go around the world and find not the most miserable places, but the happiest, the most creative.
Right.
And that's what I've been doing for going on 10 years now.
Where did the title come from? Because when I read it, the first thought I was like, wait a minute, it's almost like the geography of creativity, and maybe it was just because there's so much baggage behind the word genius.
Right, but it's a loaded word, right?
Yeah.
And it's an aspirational word. No one self-describes themselves as a genius, right? It's
Right.
always, like most, not a real genius at least, right? It's always someone else calling you that. Look, my favorite, all-time favorite quote about genius that I think explains it is from the philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer. He said the difference between genius and talent is that talent hits the target no one else can hit, and genius hits the target no one else can see. Mm-hmm. So in genius, there's always that leap. It's not just more whatever. It's a leap into a whole other realm that people hadn't even thought of. And being a place person, I wanted to not only write about geniuses, but write about the places they lived and worked, where they got their ideas from. Because I really do believe that place shapes us, that who we are is really determined by where we are. It really affects us. And, if you take Leonardo da Vinci out of, say, Florence and put him in, Indianapolis, driving a taxi in the year 2017, is he going to be Leonardo da Vinci? I don't think so. I think the place is that important.
What I love is, even though it is titled The Geography of Genius, is that I love how you're mixing, how creativity is mixed in with genius, and that it's not, when I think of creativity, I think of artists, which is not always
Right.
great. But in your book, you really connect, like you said, how, like, whether it is maybe a Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo, but then there could be like an Einstein or a philosopher, and or just looking at how maybe a city or a town deals with agriculture, and
Right.
that's a creative process. So you really opened my mind to what genius actually is defined.
Yeah, I think it's genius is not just someone who's really smart with a high IQ. In fact, if you look historically, there are lots of people who've had really high IQs who didn't produce anything that we remember today. And there are people who had more or less average IQs who have produced great works of creative genius. And, creativity, I want to disabuse you of the idea that creativity is just about art.
Right.
I mean, you can be a creative scientist like Einstein. You could be a creative agriculturalist. You can be a creative cameraman, who's taking pictures and photos. You could be a creative accountant. I suppose there's creative accounting as well.
There's probably some good or bad.
Yeah, which is not always legal now that I think about it. But creativity is not limited to art. So this notion of, the artist with with his palette and his paints, and that's what the creative person is. That's one kind of creative person. It's not the only kind.
As you're traveling through all these different cities, and I'd love to know as well, like why you picked those cities or how that came about. But certainly, what I thought was interesting, you said, is that genius tends to just pop up. Like it's interesting how you would find these places and times that just all of a sudden, I almost call it like it's like an incubator, like things that are just right. And why? And it fluctuates. And through your traveling, why do you think that happens, or what caused that?
Well, you're right. They pop up. You don't see geniuses just randomly spread around. One in San Francisco, one in La Paz, Bolivia. You see them, clumped together in what I call genius clusters. Right, certain places at certain times have produced just this motherlode of brilliant minds. To find out. There's no one easy answer, but you're right about one thing. They are kind of unexpected. They're not predictable. I mean, now we look back at, say, Athens during its classical period around 450, 400 BC. We say, well, of course Athens. But Athens was not your most likely Greek city-state to achieve this genius status. There were hundreds of these Greek city-states, of which Athens was only one. They were more like what we call countries today than cities. So Athens didn't have the most money, didn't have the most powerful army, so it had something, though, going for it, something culturally that allowed it to make that leap to genius. And it is cultural. It's not that these places have lots of natural resources. In fact, having lots of natural resources, such as oil, probably makes a place less likely to become a genius cluster because they've got everything. They don't have to work for it. They don't have anything to push against. And a place like Athens, they had to work for it.
Yeah, and I think taking that 10,000-foot view of your book, I think just seeing the threads that kind of weave in between, I think that was one of the most surprising ones for me, was realizing, like, oh, wait a minute, I guess that makes sense that the more you have doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be more innovative or a genius cluster, but it was almost like there has to be a measure of struggle. And I thought that was fascinating. But to the culture point, I was going to ask you about, specifically with Athens. One was just, I had no idea how passionate they were with, like, the physical side, the mental side, and how important, walking, for example, was. And then, of course, my mind started going to Van Gogh and others, where that was also a passion. Like, they'd walk 6-7 miles a day.
Charles Dickens also. Mark Twain was a big pacer. Sigmund Freud would, take a several-mile constitutional in Vienna every afternoon. There's a real connection between walking and creativity. And in fact, there's a study done recently out of Stanford University that sort of confirms this scientifically. They took two groups of people. One group, they had walking out in the woods. Another group, they had sitting down in a chair, like I am now. And then afterwards, they gave them a test designed to measure creative thinking. And it was that first group that was outdoors walking that showed a bigger boost in creative thinking than the group sitting in a chair. There's something about putting one foot in front of the other that makes us more creative. And I think it comes down to our subconscious, essentially. That when you're walking, you're using your body and you're using your mind, but you're using it in a different way. There's a reason people get great ideas while walking or while in the shower. It's because we've let our subconscious mind sort of take over and chew on this problem that we're trying to solve and come up with a new solution.
There was a great quote speaking about, it almost takes a city to raise a genius. But then you couldn't take away, if you just secluded itself from outdoors, that experience, that it wouldn't work. And just trying to find, like, how do we figure out what's the balance of, like, what do you need and how big and small?
Yeah, it's there's no exact formula. Yeah. If there is, I'd be wildly wealthy and probably wouldn't have time to sit with you now. I'd be on my yacht somewhere. But I think there is a balance between nature and city. You're right. Most of these genius clusters, with very few exceptions, were cities. Now, why is that? Well, one is simply that's where the people are. I know that sounds crazy obvious, but if you're going to be a genius, you need recognition, right? I really don't believe there's such a thing as an undiscovered genius, that you need that talent and that creativity. You need other people to say, hey, Leonardo, Michelangelo, that's great artwork. You guys are terrific, you know? And you find that in the cities. The other thing you have going on in cities are what are known as interaction opportunities. If you picture a tube, like a cylinder, with a bunch of molecules moving around very fast in there, the more molecules you have in there, densely packed, moving around, the more likely they are to bump up against each other and to form new combinations. Creativity. That's another thing that's going on. But I don't think being in a totally intensely urban environment without any access to nature is good. Almost all the geniuses that I write about in my book, they lived in cities, but they would escape to the countryside. Sigmund Freud would go off into the Austrian Alps to go hiking. While we're in Austria, we can talk about Beethoven. He would, every weekend almost, go up into what's called the Wienerwald, this forest outside of Vienna, and go for long walks in the countryside. Mozart did a similar thing. I think a really good creative city is one that does have these interaction opportunities, but also gives people a chance to retreat. I think all geniuses are always sort of toggling between that conversation with others and that conversation with themselves.
Speaking of Florence, and then of course Slavs, reminded me of Michelangelo.
Yeah.
And I got to admit, in your book, that chapter alone, I think I read it probably 3 or 4 times because it just fascinated me. I had no idea that, and I was wondering if you could speak to it, was just the conditions, the atmosphere, and like the health conditions of the area.
Right.
It just, nothing made sense. Like, how in the world did that make for the stew for innovating these geniuses coming out?
Well, first of all, again, Florence is not an obvious place. You know, they didn't have a seaport. And you look at the rise of the Renaissance in the 15th century in Florence, and what are they coming out of? What had the city just undergone? The plague, the Black Death. A third of the population is wiped out, and you think that would be it for Florence for centuries. But no, some 50 years after this Black Death, you see the flowerings of the Italian Renaissance. And I think some historians will back this up, that as horrible as the plague was, and it was horrible, it shook things up as well. And you always see this with these genius clusters. You see some sort of tumult. It might be a war, it might be this plague. Something happens before that shakes things up, and then you see a flowering of genius. And that's what happened in Florence. And it was also a crowded city. You had these workshops called bottega in Italian, where people like Leonardo, young Leonardo, a teenager, would apprentice. Yeah, Leonardo was an apprentice for 10 years, essentially an unpaid intern in today's parlance, we would say. And he worked his way up from, cleaning up after the chickens because they needed the eggs to make the paint before they used paint.
Yeah, tempera. Okay, yeah.
Tempera, yes. You know about this?
Yeah, you're on my playing field.
Okay, good. So that's what they were using, at least in the beginning of Leonardo's career, and that meant chickens and rabbits for glue, and so it was kind of a barnyard atmosphere.
Right, yeah.
And he worked his way up. And what I found fascinating as I researched this is how, just like you would see in an office today with interns given more and more responsibility, first getting the coffee, then making copies, then, whatever, you saw Leonardo given more and more responsibility. And his mentor, the one who ran the bottega, was a man named Andreas Verrocchio. And Verrocchio was a pretty good artist, but he would allow Leonardo to sort of paint inside his paintings. Like there's a famous painting that shows a young boy carrying a fish. And art historians are pretty sure today that the fish, even though the painting was done by Verrocchio, the fish was done by a young Leonardo da Vinci. And I found that fascinating.
Yeah. One of the quotes in your book reminded me of, and just learning more about, like the Medici family and what it represented, and where it says, what's honored in a country will be cultivated there.
That's from Plato. And that quote is, I hope you read my book, but if you don't, that's all you need to know. Is that quote. Because that really explains so much of what I'm trying to convey. What is honored in a country will be cultivated there. And don't get hung up in the word country. You could say what's honored on a campus, what's honored in a city, what's honored in a culture. You could say what's honored in a family will be cultivated there. And what was honored in Florence of this time period, 14th, 15th century, was in 16th century was beauty. They really honored beauty, and so they cultivated it. And the Medici family was in a position to play the role of talent scout. You know, they had the money too.
Right.
But that helped a lot. But merely having money alone doesn't make you a genius cluster. You can't buy this. Money helps, but money alone is not sufficient.
Yeah, and I think that really fascinated me, that aspect, that they weren't just giving money, they were helping like foster it. Like you said,
Right.
They were bringing in artists and they were making sure they were taken care of to the point where they could focus on making beautiful things and creating. And
I mean, there's one story that I love about one of the Medicis named Lorenzo. Lorenzo de Medici, but he went by the name Lorenzo the Magnificent. It's what his business card said, so everyone called him that.
Right.
And one day he's just out, in the Medici gardens, and he notices this young kid working on a statue of a Roman deity, and it's pretty good. In fact, it's very good, and especially for a 14-year-old. And Lorenzo just on the spot sort of makes a bet on this kid and says, "Kid, you've got talent. You should come live with me. The richest man in Florence. I'll give you the best teachers, the best materials." And it was a good bet because, as you probably know, that kid is now known by his first name, Michelangelo. Now we know Michelangelo is the genius, but maybe Lorenzo was the genius,
Right.
or maybe, as I would argue, the entire city of Florence was the genius. And we don't think of it that way. And I think that really is a problem for cultivating creativity, because we think, we started by talking about the word genius, and we think of geniuses as just like a shooting star, like, oh, there goes one.
Right.
I wonder if there'll be another one. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. As opposed to something we can actually cultivate, like you don't just try to grow an apple tree in concrete. You're like, gotta find the right soil, gotta water it. It's the same thing with genius, I believe.
loving the opportunity to ask you about this quote, one of my favorite quotes in the book, and I just want to kind of like know where your thought was on it. And it's, "The story of the world is not the story of coups and revolutions. It is a story of lost keys and burned coffee and a sleeping child in your arms. History is the untallied sum of a million everyday moments," which is
That's me, yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, and I think we forget that, history is usually told as the stories of wars and disasters, but that's what history is, history is, holding a sleeping child in your arms, it's petting your cat, it's going for a walk in the woods, it's sitting here and having a conversation like we are. And these events don't normally make news, they don't are not normally archived for centuries, but that's what history is. And most of the world is actually pretty good, and we need to remind ourselves of that. And that's what I try to do in my writing.
And I loved it because I think when I read that quote, and I know for ourselves in Artrageous, one of the things that I've always wanted to do was make artists, creatives, innovators, etc., more human, like
Right.
realize that they're people.
Yeah.
And I feel like
Often flawed people too, I might add.
Right, very flawed, and
Yeah.
you connect with them even more. And I think
Right.
you brought so much of that in your book of just making these people human.
Yeah, they were all imperfect, but somehow they pushed past their imperfectness. They didn't let it stop them. I'll tell you about this man I met in Iceland, researching my book, The Geography of Bliss, and his name was Hilmar, and he is a very successful, talented composer of classical music. He's done a lot of scores for Hollywood, and really he was the mentor to the singer Bjork. You may have heard of her. So he's a really, exceptional musician. But he seemed happy, and this confused me because I think of the artist as just suffering all the time. And I asked him about it, and I said, "Hilmar, you're a very successful, talented artist, but you're happy, what gives?" He says, "I am happy, but I cherish my melancholia, cherish my sadness." And I think all artists have that part of them. If they may be happy, but they always have some side of them that's unhappy, that's imperfect, but they don't squash it. They honor it to some extent, and that's sort of the reservoir where they get their creation from.
it's been interesting to see in the book just everyday people that living in times and situations that are totally negative in a lot of senses, or just they create a huge struggle, and they embraced it. And actually, in a lot of ways, and I think you mentioned the point of that allowed them to see chances to be creative, or like to find a cure to something, or to be like, I need to innovate because of the struggle.
Right. So this is one of the conclusions I reach, is that creativity, not only does creativity not require perfection, creativity would not flourish in paradise. You know, we all want paradise, but if you were living in paradise, what would be the impetus? What would be the motivation to create anything? You know, the poet Robert Frost, he talked about free verse poetry. Free verse poetry is where you have no rules, right? You can just write, you know, whatever kind of words, string them together, and it sounds like, oh, that would be so liberating. But Frost said that writing free verse poetry is like playing tennis without a net. And so we need the net. Artists, all these artists you met, they all were playing with a net, meaning there's an obstacle in their way. And they have to work around it or over it in the case of that. And they're just the ones who worked harder to get the ball over the net.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great analogy for that. Yeah. Well, I had a couple different things I wanted to ask you about. One was a couple of studies that you mentioned in the book that I thought were fascinating. And one of them was by Robert Sternberg, where they took some Chinese students, and apparently they basically told them that they were creative. And it showed like a dramatic increase in their creativity. Just being told, like, hey, you are creative.
Especially the Chinese students, because they did the same thing with American students, and there was, I believe, a much smaller boost in creative thinking. It's almost as if, given the Chinese culture of, to some extent, conformity and honor the elders and that sort of thing, Confucian values, they showed a greater boost. That just being told, be creative, it's okay.
Right.
Given license to be creative. It was fascinating. You know, here in the West, in the U.S., we tend to think of creativity as almost always having to do with novelty, right? If you're going to do something creative, it must first and foremost be new. Right. I mean, we think of them almost as synonymous. But in China, not so much the case.
I agree. Well, and that reminded me of, and I was going to ask you about this, genius is not about how often you succeed, but how many times you start over. Or I love how you, I don't know if you coined this or not, but the superfluidity and the power of backtracking.
Right. That's from a psychologist named Dean Simonton, University of California, Davis, who's done tremendous work in this field. And his research shows that geniuses fail, right? We all fail. But in fact, geniuses fail more often than non-geniuses, right?
Right.
You know, there was a scientist, two-time Nobel Prize winner named Linus Pauling. And he was asked by a student, you know, Dr. Pauling, how do you come up with so many good ideas? He said, well, it's easy. I come up with lots of ideas and I throw away the bad ones. And that's what the genius is good at. And so they will fail, but they will remember where and how they failed. It sort of gets stored on their hard drive in their brain.
Right.
And they create what's known as failure indices. That's what psychologists call it. The genius probably just thinks that he's remembering it, right? And so when they're presented with a new situation, they might call up that previous failure and say, you know, it didn't work back then, but using that blue paint here might work in this situation, for instance. So that's that backtracking. The superfluidity is coming up with lots of ideas part. The backtracking is being willing to go back and recycle those old failed ideas. Basically, and I'm just sort of thinking this for the first time, geniuses are hoarders of ideas. You know?
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, they never throw anything away.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think, and I'm going to mention one of my favorite parts of this book, but it reminded me of when I go to speak with kids or anyone, I always tell them that, you know, if you go to a museum, just art, for example, you're only really seeing maybe 2% of an artist's work, but it took the other 90 to 99 to actually get there. And I love, and speaking of museums, one of my favorite things, you said there needs to be a museum of just crap, of just all this junk it took, which I just really appreciated you speaking to that and just the importance of attempts.
Right. I mean, in the museums as we have it today, they don't show you process. Right. They just show you the product. But this museum of crap, and I'm glad we can say that, would have all this bad stuff, all the failures. It's sort of a museum of failure. Might be another way to look at it.
Yeah.
And to show the process of how Picasso got to that masterpiece, or Einstein got to his theory of relativity. Because you're right, the museum is the tip of the iceberg. You're seeing a tiny percentage of the artist's good work and a tiny percentage of their overall work as well.
Right. Speaking of the idea of just attempts and everything, and with kids, I think there's this struggle of not realizing that you do have to, it's fun, and the power of just innovative and genius and fun. And
It should be play.
play, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
exactly.
it should not feel like work. And I think, when Einstein was wrestling with his formulas, or Leonardo with his art, I mean, they're working at it, but they enter into this psychological state that's known as flow. And when you're in flow, you lose sense of time. Time just becomes irrelevant, essentially. And you even kind of lose sense of yourself in a good way.
Yeah.
So that instead of a person painting a picture, they're simply painting. Or a dancer dancing, they're simply dancing. And I think all geniuses achieve that state when they're working at their best level.
Right.
They also have times where they just have really bad days.
Right.
Einstein had bad days. Leonardo had bad days. But they got up the next day and they started over again.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's a great reminder, like you said, of just the pressure to be original now. I see a lot of that of just, if I don't get it on the first try, and just realizing part of the fun is the attempts, the failure.
Right.
And I think it's just a great reminder that one of those threads through your book of just, like how important that process is.
Mm-hmm. Trying to be original is really hard and puts undue pressure on you, I think. When I was writing my first book, The Geography of Bliss, I was struggling. I'd never written a book before. And the best advice I got to a friend when she saw me struggling, she said, Eric, don't try to write a good book or an original book. Just write an honest book.
Yeah.
And that was really good advice, because when you try to paint a masterpiece, you freeze up. But if you're trying to paint something honest or write something honest, we're all capable of tapping into that source of honesty.
Well, before I let you go, two quick questions.
Okay.
One was, if as you look, and I love how you got this overview at the end, and I don't want to give away the entire end of this book. So,
no spoiler alerts.
Yeah, no spoiler alerts. But two things I wanted to just get was, one, on, in schools and corporations, like, just if, people who are reading this or even getting the chance to hear you speak and saying, what can I do? Like, how can we better create an environment? Because, there's the Googles and everybody else who's trying to create high-end fun, and it's,
Right.
slides and everything else. But I love in your book too at the end, and I was on the other side of just in your house, like coming up with you gave some awesome, just great, simple ideas as a parent even of what you can do to cultivate a better environment for innovation and creativity and genius. So I just like your thoughts on that.
Well, I call it the 3 Ds, with a bonus 4th D thrown in. People like threes. First D is diversity. Not ethnic diversity per se, although that can be a very good thing, but diversity of ideas. This is the tolerance part of creativity. Another way of looking at it is being open to experience. When psychologists look at the different traits that creative people have, studiousness or imagination, whatever, the one trait that is the most important is this openness to experience. That means being open to a diversity of experiences. The second D is discernment, right? You can't just have this everything's equally good. You have to be willing to, as the poet Allen Ginsberg said, kill your darlings. You have to be willing to actually recognize that not all these ideas you had at 3 a.m. are equally good. Sure. A discerning eye. And the third D is disorder. You actually, and maybe this is not something that teachers or parents want to hear, but a little bit of messiness, a little bit of chaos is actually essential for the creative process. Not total anarchy, but
Right.
a little bit of messiness is good. In fact, there's studies that show that people with messy desks do better in these creative thinking exams than people with a neat desk. And the fourth bonus D is, and we've talked a little bit about this before, is discomfort. That idea that you have to have something to push against. And I do worry a little bit, you see this in Silicon Valley with these companies giving employees everything they need, laundry service, dry cleaning, food, ping pong tables, gotta have a ping pong table.
I mean, I'm not gonna create unless I've got,
Yeah, create, like no ping pong table. Where's the foosball?
Right.
Can't create without foosball. When really what those employees need is a challenge, is something to push against. You look at the companies that we now associate with the creative genius of Silicon Valley, which is sort of our Florence of this day and age, and Apple and Google, and they were started on a shoestring budget in a garage or something like that. So those people, Steve Jobs and the founders of Google, were responding to the sort of constraints of their situation. So I think if you sort of do those things and sort of think, in this environment, am I cultivating these things? It's not a matter of do this, this, and this, and you get creativity. I like to think of the agriculture analogy. You're a farmer, and you've got to have the right weather, you've got to get the right soil, you got to water the soil, and you do have to have the right seed as well. But then hopefully you get a good crop,
right?
But maybe not.
Yeah, no, that's great. All right, guys. Well, thank you, Eric. I mean, this has been like a dream come true. Pleasure to meet you.
Likewise.
A lot cooler than I even thought. Great talking
That
with you.
cool. Good.
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting my favorite subject. So, hey, guys, please, and I'm not just saying this, you got to go grab these books. Now, I'm going to say I love this one. I'd say The Geography of Genius, but if you're going, just do this one too, because they're both just so much. Like you said, getting a chance to see your country and yourself and creativity from the outside in, and just really inspired by these. So go grab them. And then, Eric, how can anybody who's watching connect with you?
I have a website, ericweinerbooks.com, ERICWEINER books.com. And if you go to my website, there's a place where you can tell me what is your happiest place and what is your most creative place and why. Let me know, and I post some of these online, or you can just email me. But it's been a pleasure.
Great questions, too, by the way. All right, guys. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And we will see you again next time. Thanks, guys.